So greeting to our participants. We'll just give another couple of minutes perhaps to make sure that we have our panelists with us and to allow an additional few minutes for folks to join the room. Just a reminder that you're in breakout session 1, which aims to look at governance for sustainable and circular bioeconomy. So I would ask that presenters and panelists who are in the room, if you could kindly turn your video on so that I'm able to see you. Other participants, if you could kindly keep your video off and your audio muted for the meantime so that we can more easily identify our panelists. Thank you.
Oh Gott, was kann man denn da machen? Kommt der Feuerwehrmann Sam? Ja. Tu mal den Ironman an die Seite. Richard, schieb mal den nach hinten. Auch den grauen, den anderen auch. Den anderen auch, hier, den Warmaster. Schieb den mal weiter nach hinten, dass er nicht kaputt geht.
Der mein roter Stück war bei der Brücke runtergefallen. Ja, der war bei der roten Brücke runtergefallen. Und der wird uns dann... Wir haben so einen großen Traktor, Papa.
Zeig mal. Oh, ein Traktor für die Schienen. Ja, super, toll.
Der bringt das
it's Annelene here, and I think maybe if we could ask again our participants to mute their mic and Peter. Awesome. So with this, I think, do we have a few, are we expecting a few more people? I see that we have all of our panelists. Erica, do you want to wait? Should we start?
I think if we have panelists, I'd be in favor of rolling along ahead. I see Walter, I see Jeff, I saw Tula earlier. So yeah. I would suggest that we get started. And just a reminder to folks, if you're having issues with tech or with the audio, you can signal that in the chat as well. And we'll just let folks, I think, join us as they come online, if that makes sense.
Awesome. And so thank you everyone for joining us on the breakout session. As Erica mentioned, this is a session around governance for sustainable and circular bioeconomy. I'm Annelene Matte, the Director of Economic Analysis with the Canadian Forest Service, the Government of Canada. And what we wanted to do with this session was really to showcase the role of stakeholder participation and governance mechanism within the process of bioeconomy strategy development. So most of the session will be a moderated discussion where we want to highlight main lessons learned from processes of bioeconomy strategy development in a few countries, but also to discuss the key challenges and opportunities associated with bridging the gaps across stakeholders. And so we heard that. So again, if our participant can mute their mic, that would be really nice. Thank you very much. And so just to remind you from what we heard earlier, some of the principles that this session is trying to discuss are around principle number 6 and 10 that from FAO around responsible and effective governance mechanism to underpin the sustainable bioeconomy. And a sustainable bioeconomy should also promote cooperation, collaboration, and sharing between interested and concerned stakeholders in all relevant domains and at all relevant levels. So the discussion will be guided by myself and also by Erica Van Nest, that you've already seen, the Deputy Director of Bioeconomy Policy at Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. So over to you, Erica.
Okay, thank you, Annelene. So as I mentioned earlier, we want to be sure that we're best leveraging this virtual format and to encourage participation from our audience, hopefully in ways that work smoothly with the technology available to us. So if there are particular points of interest or highlights from the discussion, please do share those in the chat, and Elena and I will be watching the chat as it rolls forward throughout the discussion. You're also very welcome to post your questions in the chat. And we're also going to try a bit of an interactive poll during this discussion as well, a little something new there. So we'll pose that question to you now before the discussion with panelists, and we'll aim to revisit that question following the panelist discussion. So asking you to proceed and vote on that question while you're hearing from our panelists. And so the question that we'll consider is, what do you think is the most important mechanism for stakeholder engagement in the bioeconomy? And you'll have a choice between 4 options: harmonize policy and regulations, establishment of an accountability, risk assessment, and monitoring system, thirdly, an inclusive consultation process with all stakeholders, or fourthly, collaboration platforms for sharing resources, skills, technology, information, and best practices. So I believe that my colleague Tony has posted the link to that poll in the chat there. So I'd ask folks to visit the chat, click on that Slido poll, or enter the code as the case may be, and please continue to vote while we hear from our panelists. I'll introduce them now. So we're really fortunate and pleased to have 3 experts with us today. So from the Trade, Economics and Industry branch at the Canadian Forest Service here in Canada, Director General Jeff Waring. Joining Jeff will be Walter Oyarzabal from the Ministry of Livestock, Agriculture and Fisheries in Uruguay. And lastly, joining them is Tuula Pakalin from the Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry in Finland. So before turning to our panelists in that discussion, and before beginning the interactive discussion, I'll ask each of those panelists to give a brief overview of the bioeconomy strategies in each of their countries. And so I'll turn to Jeff Waring to begin for Canada.
Thanks, Erica. Can you just confirm that you can hear me?
Perfectly, thank you.
Good. Okay, great. And welcome to everybody to this session. This is my first time at the Global Bioeconomy Summit, so really looking forward to a productive discussion today. So again, thanks, Erica, for the introduction. In terms of the strategy and the framework for Canada, as many of you in this virtual session may know, Canada is a federation. And ultimately, this means that individual provinces and territories in Canada have independent jurisdiction over many aspects of their internal affairs, which is at the core of the bioeconomy. If folks put their microphones on mute, that'd be greatly appreciated. So as I was saying, Canada is a federation. Provinces and territories manage their own land. Provinces and territories own and manage over 90% of the forests in Canada, so they're really central to the bioeconomy and to the development of a strategy in our context in Canada. So making a long story short, in 2017, informed by consultations with a variety of stakeholders, the Canadian Council of Forest Ministers, which are ministers responsible for the forests at the federal, provincial, and territorial level, unanimously endorsed a forest bioeconomy framework. The framework is now 3 years old and in full implementation phase along 4 core pillars. These pillars include, first, leveraging the bioeconomy to build strong and resilient communities, in particular by offering skills training and education programs to rural and Indigenous communities that are really on the front lines of the forest sector. The second is fostering predictability in this emerging industry by establishing certainty and standards for biomass supply. Third, fostering increased demand for bioproducts by improving the public perception and awareness of the bioeconomy. And finally, being able to deliver cost-effective and environmentally responsible products by supporting innovation and deployment of first-in-kind technologies in Canada. So this framework really represents the what, as well as the where Canada wants to go for the bioeconomy. And interestingly enough, just over a year ago, an industry-led association called Biodesign, which consists of a variety of actors in the Canadian bioeconomy space, leveraged this government framework to release its own strategy on Canada's bioeconomy. Their strategy aims to identify the opportunities, challenges, as well as appropriate actions to make the framework become reality, and ultimately to capture the bioeconomy as a growth opportunity. So what's really interesting is while the framework describes the what and the where we want to go, the biodesign strategy outlines the how industry will ultimately get there. The other thing that we keep in our minds when we look at the framework and this industrial strategy is that it really demonstrates that there's a strong buy-in across the bioeconomy value chain in Canada around this framework. So thanks. So that's a very brief overview of our framework.
Thanks very much for that, Jeff. And so we'll now move to Walter in Uruguay.
Thank you very much. Good day to everybody. Thanks for the invitation to participate and share some information with you. Well, Uruguay, we could say in lato sensu that Uruguay is somehow a bioeconomy because it's an economy strongly based on biological processes and biological principles. So in this regard, it could be seen as a bioeconomy. But from other point of view, if we consider the value added by considering altogether sustainability, circularity, increase in the efficiency in the use of natural resources, regeneration, restoration, biodiversity, possibilities for innovation and inclusiveness, then we are not satisfied with how our bioeconomy complies with these opportunities. So we see a gap and a very interesting opportunity to move in the direction of what the changing paradigm to sustainable circular bioeconomy could offer. And in 2015, the National Planning Office conducted an interinstitutional processes to elaborate the national policy, long-term policy for Uruguay with a horizon of 2050. And two main pillars were identified for the future of the country. One of them is bioeconomy, precisely. The other is digital economy. So, and both could be interconnected and have positive synergies. So after that definition, there was the recognition of the need to elaborate a strategy. How do we start implementing this transformation of our economy in the direction of an economy that is progressively reduces its dependence on fossil fuels. It produces more with environmental added value without affecting or without increasing the pressure on our natural resources, and do it in a planified manner. After that, this year we had a change in government. A new party came, and fortunately, the new authorities understood that this direction for development is correct. Is a state policy for the long term. So we have a ratification of the importance, the central importance of bioeconomy for the future of Uruguay. So we think that bioeconomy offers the possibility to put together different initiatives that are sparse and have significant synergies between them, and put us in the way to a future that is much more promising for our inhabitants and contributing to the sustainable development also of the planet. So this is my basic introduction. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Walter. A really compelling summary of the situation in Uruguay and all that you're considering there. Next, I'll turn to Tuula Pakala from Finland. Tuula.
Thank you. Can you hear?
Yes, perfectly. Thank you.
So in Finland, the goals of bioeconomy include reducing dependence on fossil natural resources, both as energy and raw materials, preventing biodiversity loss, and creating new economic growth and jobs in line with the principles of sustainable development. The objective of the Bioeconomy Strategy, which was published in 2014, is to push bioeconomy output up to 100 billion euros by 2025 and to create 100,000 new jobs. So we had really numerical objectives defined there. The actual strategy was drafted in a participatory process involving several ministries, several research organizations, and other stakeholders. And we have them consulted in 5 workshops, 3 regional bioeconomy forums, and sectoral consultations. And in addition, we had even public opinion asked via an internet questionnaire. The bioeconomy strategy is currently being updated along the lines stated, for example, by the EU bioeconomy strategy, and considering also the new potentials from circular bioeconomy. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tula. I'll now turn to Anne-Hélène.
Thank you very much to our 3 panelists for presenting their countries. We will now be starting the moderated discussion, and so we'll kickstart the first round of questions, and after that we'll just go through the raised hands. And the first question is actually aligned with one that was asked in the chat from Daniel Kefeli, and so it's for Walter. And my computer appears to be Walter, how important is it to harmonize or adapt policy, regulations, and institutional systems that are relevant to bioeconomy sectors? So if you could also tell us what it means in your views, what it could mean in practice, and over to you.
Thank you very much. Well, this is a good question, and I could have two answers, short and longer. That would be that yes, it is essential to harmonize and adapt policies, regulations. A bioeconomy strategy does not begin from zero. I think this is the case of Uruguay, but maybe it's the case for every country, because all countries produce biomass in some way or another, utilize this biomass. So there are things that already exist. We are not starting to produce biomass. We are continue to produce more, better, new. So this is a short answer. Yes, it is essential. But giving more details in the longer answer, I could say that when we started preparing the strategy in 2016, we found that there are plenty of norms, regulations, institutions, experiences, technologies, stakeholders, and that can be the base for the direction of sustainable circular bioeconomy. And a transformation, as it is obvious, needs something that is in the baseline. If to transform something, you need to have something. So you need to know this is something you are going to or intend to transform in a certain direction. So we started by mapping what already exists in terms of this regulation, policies, norms, etc. Because well, is to know where we are now and where we want to go. So we need to answer these questions. Make it clear where we are now, what we have now, what are the gaps, what are the opportunities, what are the barriers, who are the key actors, and where we want to go together as a society, and mobilize resources in this direction. So when we started preparing this strategy, we could identify an important set of plans, policies, and initiatives. For example, we have 9 main policies related to promotion of sustainable development. For example, related to climate change, related to water management, related to conservation of biodiversity, related to native forests, to a recent law on agroecology, general law to manage wastes and residues, national adaptation plan. So policies that are embedded in our national contribution to the Paris Agreement related to mitigation and adaptation. So, and then we went to see for horizontal policies. And we found 4 main big policies already in place, for example, related to tax exemption as incentives to produce in a certain better manner, to promote research, development, and innovation, to promote circular economy and green growth, and to promote exports and attract investments to Uruguay. We also identified 8 vertical policies related to climate smart agriculture in Uruguay, led by the Minister of Agriculture, sectoral plan for biotechnology, national fund for renewable energy, and etc. And also 9 main initiatives related to innovation, technology development, and promote entrepreneurs and incubate new enterprises. So we saw that we had a lot of pieces of the puzzle, many of them disconnected. So we have some kind of fragmented set of pieces. We could try to put together, see how they match, and also see what pieces are missing, because you have something, but you also identify that other things that are needed do not exist, and you need to find those pieces and see what is the shape that you need to fit into your puzzle. So in this regard, we see that as bioeconomy is a cross-cutting issue. It's not something that only related to the Ministry of Agriculture, because we are so close to biomass in the primary sector, but it also involves Ministry of Energy, Ministry of Industry, and Ministry of Health. Well, so we to develop this national strategy, the key decision was to create a cross-cutting working group and work with this transversal or cross-cutting and participatory approach in order to develop a consensus on what are the main goals of our strategy and what are the best or the main steps that should be given in order to move forward in the long-term direction. So this working group was the basis of the preparation of the strategy. Now we have the document with the strategy already available. And now we are formalizing the governance. And this governance is going to have 2 levels. One will be the National Commission for Bioeconomy at ministerial level, but also the Bioeconomy Working Group, where government, civil society, and private sector and the academy and science will interact and will try to develop all the synergies and interlinkages that are needed to move forward in the many challenges direction that bioeconomy can offer to our country. So this is where we are now, just very close to formalize the governance of the process and start implementing the strategy. I think I only have 5 minutes, so I don't know, maybe I have used more of your time. Thank you very much, and if then there are any further questions, I'd be very happy to answer them. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Walter. It was a very interesting and comprehensive response. The next question is for Tula, and in fact it builds, I think, it follows very nicely from what you raised. So you talked a lot about mapping what you've got, whether it's biophysical, policy, or institutional, and then getting a sense of where to go from there. Where do you want to take all this? And I think from there you need to get a sense maybe of monitoring. And so Tula, I was wondering if you could tell us how you think the implementation of bioeconomy monitoring system can contribute to a more sustainable bioeconomy. And so we see, a few of the building sub-questions around whether it actually does help the monitoring system to reduce trade-offs around the stakeholders or around the strategy objectives, and what's your experience in Finland?
Thank you for the question. First of all, I would like to remind that risk assessment and management is always linked with continuous monitoring, because that facilitates adaptation and mitigation measures. And the Finnish bioeconomy is monitored using 5 indicators. We have output, value added, investments, employment, and exports. And we cover several sectors: forest sector, food sector, bioeconomy services, water treatment and supply, construction, energy, and other industries. And when we monitor indicators over sectors, we know how close to the output target we are. In 2019, the output of the bioeconomy was 74 billion euro. And you remember when I said that the target in 2025 was 100 billion. So we have still 26 billion to go to achieve. And it seems that because the target is so close, we would need more than 5% increase in the output volume during the next few years, while between 2018 and 2019, the output volume increased by 1% only. So this shows that how closely we have to monitor the development. And when we monitor the development by sectors, we get information on emerging challenges and potentials. For example, the role of services, for example, tourism, has been increasing in recent years, but obviously the coronavirus pandemic may influence the future development. It has already influenced a lot the more recent development, because we haven't had that many foreign people coming to Finland, but our national tourism has increased somewhat. There are also challenges related to monitoring itself. For example, bioeconomy may have indirect effects to several sectors outside conventional bioeconomy accounts, and these linkages should be made visible using bioeconomy statistics and indicators. And another challenge is that bioeconomy varies between countries and regions a lot, and therefore the statistics, regional and national statistics, they focus on providing information on their specificities. And if we want to compare countries or regions between each other, we would need comparable statistics. We would need to harmonize statistics. So therefore, we need to seek for balance between these specificities that help real smart specialization between regions, but we need also harmonization to be able to monitor across countries and regions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tula. That was quite interesting. And you talk about harmonizing and the need for balance around people who need information, or we need to understand what's happening at the granular level versus at the national level. And this ties quite well with the next question, in fact, for Jeff Waring. And in Canada, from what you've told us, there is a private sector-driven strategy. There's also been a largely sectoral approaches, whether they are in the agriculture world or in the forest world. And there is also a government strategy in a context of shared responsibilities amongst the federal and the provincial governments, as well as efforts around increasing and enabling Indigenous participation. So I guess I'm repeating all that because it seems quite complicated with a lot of potential for people to go into different directions. And I was wondering if you could share with us some of the key lessons learned in building an inclusive consultation process. And that ties with quite a few of the questions in the chat around engaging the private sector and engaging other groups, including NGOs.
Thanks, Annela. And in terms of lessons learned, well, I'll keep it fairly short to stick within the time frame. I'll focus on 3 of them, and in fact, 2 have already been addressed by the other panelists on this session. But I'll speak to it in the context of Canada and our experience in developing the framework and working with industry on the strategy. So the 3 areas that I'll focus on, one is around data, monitoring and measuring the bioeconomy. The second is, as you said, the engagement piece, the relationships that we've built and some of the lessons learned around that. And then third is something that Walter had already raised, which is looking at bioeconomy as a cross-cutting theme, as opposed to just a standalone initiative. So on the issue of data, one of the key lessons learned is squarely on that aspect and measuring the bioeconomy. In my view, being able to measure the bioeconomy in all of its aspects, whether it's social, economic, or environmental, allows us to be more effective when we engage stakeholders and allows us to develop more thoughtful and targeted discussions with a variety of different stakeholder groups. And at the end of the day, it brings us back to a common baseline. What is the current status of the bioeconomy, let's say, in a particular jurisdiction? And it allows the conversation to determine what priorities, what are our targets, where do we want to go from that purpose or from that data point. In Canada, we've made some progress on data, but there's still room to do more, room to improve. Just as an example, the Canadian Forest Service, where I work, we publish an annual report called the State of Canada's Forest Report. This is an effective tool for aggregating data on forestry and sustainability, and is widely regarded as the go-to source of statistical information on the forest. What we see by publishing this data and having it verified and being known as a reliable source of data for the forest, every single stakeholder that we work with uses that same data. So there's common messaging, there's a common baseline of information at the forest sector level. However, there is an ongoing need for advanced bioeconomy data. To collect data both at the micro level in order to be able to track what's going on within the different elements of the bioeconomy and within the different subsectors, but then also to be able to assess progress at a more macro level. This can be achieved, at least in Canada, by building on existing data collection tools like industry surveys, as well as leveraging strong support from industry associations and other stakeholders to ensure that we get good quality results from the survey tools that are being launched. Data at this level ultimately allows us to develop, again, that common understanding, as I was saying earlier, and awareness of the bioeconomy, It allows us to speak from a data perspective to all Canadians, so it helps promote a common understanding of what the bioeconomy is and the progress being made in that regard. So a second lesson is the importance of convening various stakeholders with a variety of different interests and stakes in the bioeconomy to build that common vision or strategy together. As I mentioned in my first set of remarks, for us in Canada, this meant bringing together over a dozen different governments across the federal, provincial, and territorial levels. Each of these governments had their own unique interests, their understandings, their win strategies within the bioeconomy, and those needed to be recognized and reconciled and ultimately addressed in the development of a strategy for the entire nation. But beyond governments, building the bioeconomy framework also involved bringing together and listening to Indigenous partners and industrial stakeholders. These two groups in particular are on the front lines of the bioeconomy. They're witnessing the transformation of industrial activities, traditional industrial activities. They're seeing demand change. They're facing the challenges within their labor pools around reskilling and upskilling to be able to meet emerging bioeconomy opportunities. And ultimately putting all of the viewpoints from governments, industry, Indigenous partners together, it took a couple of attempts to get this framework across the finish line. But at the end of the day, when we did, the end result had hundreds of stakeholders that owned a piece of it. They saw themselves in this framework. So my lesson learned from that is to engage early and to engage often. And even after you've released that strategy or framework, to keep the dialogue going with a variety of different stakeholder groups, whether it's industry, NGOs, Indigenous communities, and so on. So my last lesson learned, goes back to Walter's issue about the bioeconomy being a cross-cutting issue. In 2017, when we released the framework, we were almost 100% focused on outlining a vision for Canada becoming a leader in the use of forest biomass for advanced bioproducts and innovation solutions. It was really all about the bioeconomy. And since then, I've been co-chairing a committee that assesses measures implemented across Canada to promote the framework. And my team and I meet regularly with industry, with Indigenous communities, with a bunch of different players that are interested in bioeconomy to track progress and look at success stories at that level. And what we've realized throughout the past 4 years is that we actually get a better sense of the progress and the successes within industry when we stop looking at the bioeconomy in isolation, just as a standalone issue, and start thinking about it as a solution to a number of different challenges and opportunities, whether it be the transition to a low carbon economy, circular economy, inclusive growth, green recovery, which is becoming increasingly important with regards to COVID. And I think both of you as moderators are a good example of how we've moved beyond looking at bioeconomy as a single issue and started to develop partnerships within government, bringing together the Forest Service with agriculture, with environment and climate change, and starting to look at how many different linkages there are for the bioeconomy to move forward on a number of different objectives. So that's in very short format, an overview of some of the lessons learned that we gathered through our experience.
Thanks very much for that, Jeff. And it's really interesting, some of the linkages you were making between circular economy, bioeconomy, and working across feedstock types are really resonant with some of the things that were popping up in the chat as you were speaking. So I think that I'm hoping folks who had some questions there found some points of resonance in what you were just saying. So now our hope is to bring in some of the audience questions and some of the audience participation that we've seen in the chat dialogue box. That doesn't mean that your opportunity to ask questions is done. So please do continue to add questions if you have aspects you'd like to go deeper on based on what you've heard, or if there's other things you'd like to discuss. And before I do that, I'll maybe just very quickly make reference to the outcome of the poll that we mentioned at the beginning of the session. So we did get some good participation in the poll. And so interestingly, and I think very resonant with what a lot of our panelists have been saying, the most highest ranked response to the question of what is the most important mechanism for stakeholder engagement in the bioeconomy was inclusive consultation processes with all stakeholders. So 42% of folks put that as their number one. And harmonization of policy and regulations came in at a relatively close second, around 35%. Followed by collaboration platforms for sharing resources, and interestingly, no takers on accountability, risk assessment, and monitoring as a top priority. Although I think, having heard from some of our panelists, perhaps folks might change their mind there. We will be rerunning that poll towards the end of the session, and we'll do a little bit of a compare between early results and later results there. Also, I see that a few people in the chat have noticed that they feel all of those elements would be important. So picking one is always really difficult. And I think we've heard that from the panelists here today, that many of you are approaching bioeconomy on a number of fronts with a number of different stakeholder groups, which I think is something we've also seen in the chat, and brings us around to a kind of a question that I would direct to the panelists. In terms of speaking perhaps in a bit more of a granular fashion to the most effective means that you've found with engaging with different populations on bioeconomy. So I think all of the panelists mentioned some of the steps they did take to follow that engagement. So wondering if you can speak a bit to your experience of what was effective, what was perhaps surprising in that engagement in terms of reaching different stakeholders. In particular, in the chat, folks have noticed that there's a need to reach folks who are less engaged in bioeconomy, who aren't bioeconomy practitioners, and in some cases, NGOs and sustainability practitioners who may have questions about the base case of the bioeconomy and how it responds to their needs. So hoping that our panelists can speak to that in some detail. I may turn first to Tula to get things started, and then invite both Jeff and Walter to jump in as they see fit.
Thank you. I followed your idea, you were curious about credibility in a way, or how to engage those who are not active. And I think there has already been discussion on these different types of panels, and nowadays we can have these public web surveys as well. And it seems to engage also those who are not traditionally involved in bioeconomy. So I think that in Finland, we haven't had that as a challenge. I think that the bigger challenges are that even if we have probably the as good information of forest resources and agricultural resources as anybody can get using modern technology, it seems still that we have challenges in communicating the statistics to the big audience. I think that people are more keen on understanding individual stands or individual fields and what's happening there. But when for example, a big bio-product factory is being planned, the resources they need are really quite big, and it seems that it's very difficult to capture the amounts and whether the resources are adequate. And I think that here is the big thing, that we really have to use modern technology to produce information, to develop logistics and develop technology so that we can be resource efficient and material efficient, and how we can decrease waste, and how we can use side streams, so that we can really show that the circular bioeconomy is happening. It's not just that we integrate some words, but we really integrate the circularity into the whole value chain. And I think that in Finland, the value chain integration, vertical integration has happened over the decades, and we are very good in there. What we need to focus is also this horizontal cross-sectoral integration, that we need to utilize agricultural and forest biomasses integrated, and we also need policy measures that address the whole agriculture and forestry sectors together, so that we can utilize land efficiently. So this may be a little bit answering your question. Thank you.
Yes, I think a really interesting sort of example there of communication to the right audiences and ensuring that sort of data-driven message resonates with stakeholders and the public. Jeff, I wonder if there's anything that you would wish to add there, and then I'll turn very briefly to Walter before moving to the next question.
Sure, and in fact, I'll probably repeat what was just said, and it's an interesting question, and it's very timely. So our group in Canada, we ended up a couple of months ago running an online survey of the bioeconomy, and this was really targeted to policymakers and experts within the bioeconomy. The early results from this survey revealed that nearly 100% of government and industry representatives do not think that the general public is sufficiently informed of the bioeconomy. Apologies, my coffee maker is just ending. Hopefully it's not too loud. So that's clear to us then that we have to do something different in terms of engaging the public in a different way on the bioeconomy. So I think we need to target a different level of the general public, not just focused on academics, on industry, but looking at opportunities to get into elementary schools, opportunities to change the language that we're using to speak about the bioeconomy, about its sustainability to regular Canadians, and providing descriptions of what the bioeconomy looks like so they can almost feel and touch it. Whether it's compostable coffee pods or using biomaterials to provide new ways of building cars and airplanes as an example. So I think taking an all systems approach to communicate the benefits of the bioeconomy will help us in the long run and help really Canadians in particular to resonate with the bioeconomy and understand what it is. Thanks.
Thanks for that, Jeff. And then I'll turn quickly to Walter in case there was anything that you wanted to add there with respect to communicating the bioeconomy in Uruguay specifically.
Yes, it is quite a challenge, and we have seen it in the process of consultation with the stakeholders, with NGOs, with private sectors during the process of preparation of the strategy. It's a challenge because there are some cultural barriers that we have to overcome. People is used to produce things in some way, and it's not easy when you come with a proposal that modifies the perspective of how a sectoral economy should work. So it was much easier and fast to progress in the good intergovernmental coordination and align our mind settings to understand that this is a really very promising pathway. Then, compared to the private sector and the enterprises, so we need a particular strategy focus on how to involve the private sector fully on the proposal. For this, we can use some platforms that already exist, because Uruguay has a tradition of private-public institutions to conduct, for example, the meat policies, the dairy product policies, the wine policies, and where a private sector and public sector interact and discuss, and this is a good basis to take ground and to start developing. But we don't have a one-size-fits-all for bioeconomy, so we need to identify tailor strategies to communicate with different publics, with different sectors. It's not the same when you speak about producing organic meat, for example, or to produce bio inputs, or to produce biopesticides, or so. There are so different types of stakeholders involved. So our strategy has an important first step in improving the dialogue by sectors. Instead of general messages that fit for everyone, start working on the specificities and the opportunities and the barriers and the gaps in main sectors that we have prioritized, because we cannot tackle all the opportunities at the same time altogether. So we did some prioritization, and we are starting to connect the private sector, the public policies, and the science and technology, but in kind of clusters, because we think it's the best way.
Thanks very much for that response, Walter. And so I think I had sort of hoped to tie back around to our sustainability and governance themes, but I did, based on the chat and based on what we were hearing, I think the communications question was one that really resonated with participants. So I'm glad we had an opportunity to spend a bit of a time there. So at this time, I'll just really sincerely thank our panelists for such an informative and an insightful conversation, and to the audience for their participation, in particular those who've been sharing documents and linkages back to the main chat in the chat for this Zoom meeting. For those who wish to access that, please do feel free to take a screenshot or paste the relevant portions of that chat, because it will disappear when we leave the Zoom window. So at this point, I think it makes sense to guide back to the main question of this session, which was, how do we effectively engage stakeholders for the development of a sustainable bioeconomy? So you'll see in the chat there, my colleague Tony has posted a link to the Slido poll once again. And so we'll ask the audience to revisit the polling question, revisit the options that are on the table there, to consider whether important stakeholder engagement, you know, what the sort of important venues are for them there, and take a look at the results and how those differ from the start of the session. I think that'll be an interesting sort of compare and contrast there. And perhaps I'll turn to Anne-Hélène. We'll continue to sort of run that in the background, I think. And just a reminder, I guess, before I turn to my co-moderator there, that we are due back in the main room of the session at around 12:15.
So thank you very much, Erica, and thank you to Walter and Jeff. So I will leave a few minutes for people to edit or adjust their opinion on the poll. I think if we go back to what we discussed around governance, it has been striking to me that the two big elements that came out from what the three of you mentioned, and even the chat room, is the issues around having a baseline, a common starting point, and the need to monitor or risk assess. So this aspect of data, of knowing what it is and how things are moving. And the second thing that has been really striking is all this discussion around communication, not only to reach out, but also to take in people's opinion, people's needs, the various stakeholders' requirements and objective in a horizontal way. And so these are the two main messages I have taken away on the path to develop effective, sustainable bioeconomy strategy, because it's not just the document, it's all that comes after when you try to implement it. And I think for those countries who have moved on to their bioeconomy strategy, the data and the accountability becomes a much stronger element, because this is what you measure yourself up against and how you adjust your strategies. And so with that, I am going to have a quick look at how things have changed in the, well, they've not changed really much, actually. It's, as far as I can see in the poll, people have not changed their opinion, and it kind of makes sense. You know, inclusive consultation processes with inclusive participation of many stakeholders as first, and harmonized policy and regulation as second. So, so with this, I think I will thank you very much. Special thanks to our panelists, Tula, Jeff, and Walter, and to our participants. I really will take a picture of the chat because there are lots of interesting considerations and papers that may come out. So I hope you enjoyed this session, and I found it very informative. It's going to stay with me, and that you can maybe loop it back as we hear from the main takeaways from the other sessions around environment, economy, and ooh, I missed one. There's another one. Well, let's leave it at this now. And thank you very much to all then.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, everyone. And a reminder that we will be recapping this session and joining the general discussion back in the plenary, which you should hopefully still have in an open tab in Chrome. Thank you.
Thank you.